Daniel Whitman's life looked flawless on paper. A corner office with a sweeping view of downtown San Francisco, a sleek black Tesla parked in the driveway, and a home that could easily be featured in any glossy interior design magazine. His wife, Vanessa, 35, was the epitome of charm and sophistication. Her wardrobe a curated collection of designer dresses, her social media feeds filled with snapshots of glamorous brunches, charity galas, and sun-drenched weekends in Napa. From the outside, they were a couple who had made it. But Daniel knew the difference between appearances and reality. He had always known it, ever since the first year of their marriage, when the honeymoon haze faded into late-night arguments over bills and trivial household decisions. The city's golden light streaming through the bay windows did little to warm the chill he sometimes felt beside Vanessa. They had built a life that dazzled others, yet in private, subtle fissures ran deep. Monday mornings were the worst. Daniel would pour coffee into his mug, while Vanessa flicked through her phone, tapping on messages with fingers painted a perfect crimson. They exchanged pleasantries. "Good morning, coffee's ready. Don't forget your meeting at 10. But the warmth was scripted. Conversations seldom lingered beyond the surface, and Daniel noticed the way Vanessa's eyes sometimes glimmered with something he couldn't name. Impatience, distraction, a hidden desire for freedom. Despite these cracks, Daniel clung to routine. He thrived in the predictable rhythms of corporate life, the sense of control, comforting. Yet every time he glanced at Vanessa laughing with friends on Instagram, a tiny knot of unease coiled in his chest. He wondered what they didn't show, what stories went untold behind the perfect snapshots. The city around them pulsed with ambition and temptation. San Francisco's cafes were filled with entrepreneurs and creatives, each pursuing reinvention, each testing boundaries. And somewhere in that electric current, Daniel feared Vanessa might be drifting too. Their social circle reinforced the illusion. Friends gushed about their inspirational marriage, commenting on how they balanced careers, lifestyle, and love effortlessly. To most, they were aspirational. Daniel, the successful tech executive, and Vanessa, the creative visionary. He smiled at compliments, nodded graciously, and thanked them, all the while sensing the performance it all required. Their public image demanded charms, smiles, and flawless weekend outings. Private dissonance had no place here. One Thursday evening, after a gala for a tech charity, Daniel returned home early, craving solitude. Vanessa lingered in the kitchen, scrolling her phone, lips curved in a knowing half-smile at some text. Daniel paused in the doorway, studying her. Something about her posture, relaxed, almost imperious, stirred a mix of admiration and unease in him. He remembered the early days when they would stay up talking about hopes, fears, and dreams, unfiltered and raw. Now, conversations were curated, strategic, rehearsed.
He made himself a drink, the amber whiskey catching the light, and sat in the living room. The silence was heavy but familiar. Vanessa eventually joined him, leaning against the back of the couch, scrolling through her phone, occasionally offering a fleeting glance. She said nothing about the gala, the friends, or the champagne that had flowed freely. She smiled, lightly, like a performer acknowledging applause, then returned to her screen. Daniel's pulse quickened, not with anger, but with a quiet, gnawing anxiety he couldn't quite shake. It wasn't that Vanessa had been unkind or cruel. She was the same woman he had fallen in love with, intelligent, witty, magnetic. It was something subtler, something in the spaces between words, in the pauses, in the way she sometimes avoided his gaze. He had felt it before, in small doses, a text she left open too long, a laugh that seemed too intimate, a weekend trip she had taken with colleagues that wasn't entirely about work. At the time, he had dismissed it, attributing it to paranoia or fatigue, but the seed of doubt had taken root, quiet, patient, growing in the shadow of perfection. Daniel leaned back, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince himself he was imagining things. The city lights blurred through the windows, golden ribbons stretching across the dark water. A perfect night, a perfect home, a perfect marriage. And yet the illusion of perfection was fragile, like glass hovering on the edge of shattering. Vanessa finally spoke, her voice casual, almost rehearsed. "Dinner's almost ready. Don't stay up too late, you've got an early meeting." The words were mundane, but the tone carried a subtle, unspoken message.
control, distance, the familiar yet insidious reminder that in her world, Daniel had his place, and her world was her own. He nodded, taking another sip of whiskey, feeling the weight of her presence and the emptiness it sometimes carried. He remembered a conversation with a colleague months ago about appearances in social media culture. People curate their lives so well you can't even tell what's real anymore, the colleague had said. Daniel thought of Vanessa, her laughter, her perfection. He realized she had mastered the art of curation, leaving him to wonder if he truly knew her anymore, or if he had only ever known a carefully designed version of her. As the night deepened, Daniel sat alone in the living room, listening to the faint hum of the city outside. The illusion of perfection was a delicate balance of charm and suppression, of desire and restraint. He sensed the tension like a taut string ready to snap, and for the first time in years, he wondered how long he could live in this beautiful, fragile cage. Somewhere beneath the smiles, the designer clothes, the sparkling weekends, a storm was quietly gathering. And Daniel knew, with a sinking certainty, that the storm would not wait. The days after that Thursday night passed with an eerie quiet, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Daniel returned to his routines with mechanical precision. Emails, meetings, business calls, but his mind lingered in the empty spaces of the Whitman residence. He noticed every minor detail, each flicker of shadow, the subtle curl of Vanessa's lips when she thought he wasn't looking. The facade of perfection began to feel like a brittle mask, cracked in ways he could no longer ignore. It started with small things. A text notification on Vanessa's phone at odd hours, silence before he could glance. A lipstick-stand coffee mug she forgot in the sink. A faint scent of perfume that wasn't hers. He told himself it was paranoia, a mind overreaching for shadows in the periphery of a picture-perfect life. Yet intuition gnawed quietly at him, a persistent whisper. One evening, Daniel returned home earlier than usual, expecting to catch Vanessa in the kitchen, as she often was, preparing her meticulously planned meals. The house smelled faintly of jasmine, a scent not native to Vanessa's usual fragrance. He hesitated at the doorway, unsure whether to confront or ignore it. Vanessa was on the sofa, scrolling her phone, legs curled elegantly beneath her, entirely absorbed. "Vanessa, is everything okay?" he asked, his voice calm but edged with tension. She looked up, startled, eyes widening for a brief heartbeat before her practiced smile returned. "Of course, Daniel, everything's fine," she said, a soft inflection that might have been reassuring if not for the subtle tightness around her eyes. He let it go for that night, sitting across from her with a glass of bourbon, listening to the distant hum of traffic outside. But the seed of doubt had grown roots. Every glance, every laugh, every absence became a puzzle piece he could not place. His memory flickered back to moments he had brushed off, a sudden trip to Los Angeles for a work event, her constant texting late at night, the way she sometimes avoided him in bed with a fleeting excuse about exhaustion. It was during a weekend brunch with friends that the cracks became impossible to ignore. Vanessa laughed with an ease Daniel had never seen with him, leaning into a colleague with an intimacy that lingered too long. He tried to smile, to join the conversation, but every word felt hollow. The clinking of glasses, the chatter, the warm morning sun, it all seemed staged, a tableau meant for others, not for him. Later that night, Daniel sat alone in the study, flipping through a photo album from their earlier years. Pictures of laughter, travel, and quiet domestic joy stared back at him. But alongside the memories, he began to notice inconsistencies, subtle changes in Vanessa's expressions, small gestures that hinted at detachment, secrets he hadn't known. The realization sank deep. He had been living with someone he only thought he knew. He remembered a conversation Vanessa had with a friend on the phone months ago, something trivial at the time, about new opportunities and exciting colleagues. He had dismissed it, trusting her implicitly, but now he couldn't unhear the underlying tone, the spark of curiosity, a hint of desire for something beyond him. The trust he had cultivated over years felt fragile, like glass under pressure, ready to splinter at the slightest touch. Over the next few days, Daniel observed Vanessa with an intensity he hadn't allowed himself before. He noted the way she moved through the apartment, each gesture precise, calculated. The way she laughed at messages on her phone, often alone in the kitchen, her posture slightly different than when she was with him. He felt a tightening in his chest, a mixture of betrayal, fear, and grief. He was not angry yet, not outwardly, but a storm gathered quietly beneath the surface, fueled by suspicion and a profound sense of displacement. One rainy evening, Daniel lingered near the living room doorway, watching Vanessa as she read a magazine. Her expression shifted subtly as she glanced at her phone, a smile curling faintly on her lips. He approached cautiously, pretending to be absorbed in a report, but the pulse in his veins thrummed with unacknowledged dread. "Who are you talking to?" he asked slightly, keeping his tone neutral. Vanessa's smile faltered, just for a fraction of a second. Then she looked up with a calm that felt rehearsed. "Just a colleague from work, nothing important," she replied, voice smooth, unwavering. But Daniel sensed the lie in the spaces between her words, the hesitation in her eyes, the way she set the phone down slightly too carefully. That night, Daniel lay awake in the bedroom, staring at the ceiling. The city lights filtered through the blinds, painting stripes across the walls. The illusion of perfection that had once comforted him now pressed like a weight. He thought of all the mornings he had woken beside her, believing in the stability of their marriage, and wondered how much of it had been real. Every compliment, every touch, every seemingly mundane moment now carried the potential for a deception. By the end of the week, Daniel realized he could no longer ignore the evidence that life had been hiding in plain sight. The subtle betrayals, the small inconsistencies, the half-truths, they all formed a pattern, one that he could no longer wish away. The house that had once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a stage, with Vanessa performing a role he no longer recognized. And in the quiet, after another night spent watching the city lights reflect on the bay, Daniel understood something vital. The cracks in the glass had been there all along. The perfection he'd believed in was a carefully constructed illusion, and the woman beside him, for all her beauty and charm, was someone he did not fully know. It was a terrifying realization, and one that would set in motion a night he would never forget.
It started as a quiet Thursday evening, unremarkable in its ordinary rhythm. Daniel returned home after an especially grueling day, his mind weighed down by client presentations, software updates, and budget disputes. The city outside was a blur of rain-slicked streets and amber streetlights reflecting on the bay. He had hoped to find solace at home, but the air inside felt heavy, charged with anticipation he could not place. Vanessa was in the living room, her phone balanced between her shoulder and ear. Her laughter floated through the apartment, melodic, casual, intentionally carefree. Daniel paused at the doorway, waiting for her to hang up, a quiet storm of unease brewing in his chest. She noticed him then, her eyes lighting up briefly, before settling into a smile that didn't quite reach her gaze. "Rough day?" she asked, placing the phone on the table. Her voice was light, airy, but it carried a subtle, calculated distance. "Normal," Daniel replied, keeping his tone neutral, his body tense with the residual unease that had been building for weeks. "Dinner ready soon?" Vanessa tilted her head, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Soon," she said, but there was a pause, a hesitation that made Daniel uneasy. He caught a faint trace of something in her expression, a mixture of amusement, control, and indifference. They sat across from each other at the dining table, the meal silent, punctuated only by the clinking of silverware. Daniel watched Vanessa, noticing the way she seemed almost intentionally distant. Her laughter at a text, her eyes flicking toward her phone, the subtle curl of her lips as if holding back a secret. All of it made his chest tighten. He had felt the fractures in the relationship for months, but tonight, the tension crystallized into something sharper, more acute. "Daniel," Vanessa began, her tone usually serious. He looked up, meeting her gaze, which held an unsettling calm. "I've been thinking." His stomach nodded. He had learned to recognize the prelude to confrontation, the subtle shift in her posture that signaled she was about to cross a line. "You know," she continued, eyes fixed on him, "you're replaceable." The words hung in the air, suspended like a shard of ice in his chest.
Daniel blinked, unsure he had heard correctly. The room seemed to shrink, the ambient light dimming in his perception. "Excuse me?" he asked, voice low, controlled, though tremors of disbelief ran through him. Vanessa's eyes met his without flinching. "Never forget it," she said. The simplicity of the phrase cut sharper than any accusation. "You're replaceable. Don't let your ego tell you otherwise." Daniel felt the floor tilt beneath him. The illusion of their life, the painstakingly maintained image of perfection, fractured instantly. He had suspected her of emotional distance, flirtations, maybe even infidelity. But this verbal dagger, pierced through years of trust and intimacy. The woman he had loved, the one he had built a life with, had reduced him to a contingency, a disposable presence. He began, but his voice faltered. Anger, hurt, and disbelief battled within him, each emotion demanding to be acknowledged. How could you say that?"
Vanessa leaned back, her expression unreadable, almost clinical in its detachment. "Because it's true," she said, "and you need to remember it before it destroys you, before it destroys us." The words burned in Daniel's mind, looping relentlessly, intertwining with memories of small betrayals, the late-night texts, the weekend getaways she had taken alone. Every overlooked signal now seemed intentional, every lapse in intimacy a deliberate fracture. The person he had believed he knew, the woman beside him for over a decade, had revealed a side he could not ignore. The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he pushed his chair back, the legs scraping the hardwood floor. The taste of bitter whiskey, once comforting, now felt sour on his tongue. He realized, with a clarity that was almost unbearable, that the life he had built was precarious, not a fortress, but a fragile stage on which illusions had been performed. Vanessa stood, smoothing her dress, and walked past him, her movements deliberate, unhurried. "I'm going out," she said casually, though Daniel's mind raced with images of betrayal. She didn't wait for a response, didn't glance back. The door closed with a soft click, leaving Daniel alone in the apartment, surrounded by shadows and the cold city lights reflecting on the bay. He sat in the living room long after she left, letting the reality sink in. Memories of laughter, intimacy, and tenderness clashed violently with the words she had spoken. The fracture was not just in their marriage, it was inside him, splitting his sense of identity, trust, and self-worth. Daniel realized that forgiveness might never come, at least not tonight, and the house that had once been a sanctuary now felt like a cage. Hours passed. Daniel moved from the couch to the bedroom, replaying the conversation over and over. He thought of the years they had shared, the milestones, the quiet mornings, the promises whispered in dimly lit rooms. He thought of the subtle signs he had ignored, the uneasy pangs of suspicion he had dismissed, and he understood with chilling precision that the person he had loved was now someone he could no longer recognize. By the time the city lights dimmed into early dawn, Daniel had made a decision. The hurt, the betrayal, the sharpness of Vanessa's words demanded action. He would no longer live in the shadow of her indifference, no longer exist as someone who could be casually replaced. The night had revealed a truth he could not unsee, and it was a truth that would demand consequence. The storm that had been quietly gathering beneath the surface of their marriage had finally arrived, and Daniel knew that nothing would ever be the same again.
The morning after Vanessa's words, Daniel woke to the cold light filtering through the blinds. The apartment was silent, but the quiet felt heavy, oppressive, as if the walls themselves had absorbed her cruelty. Coffee in hand, he wandered from room to room, eyes tracing the familiar contours of their life together. Photos of vacations, awards, casual snapshots of smiles and celebrations. But now every image seemed tainted, every memory shadowed by doubt. He tried to convince himself it was a moment of anger, a careless verbal jab fueled by frustration.
Yet a nagging suspicion lingered. Vanessa's charm, her late nights, the subtle disappearances, it all replayed in his mind, scenes strung together like a film reel he had ignored for too long. He remembered the unusual patterns. Weekends claimed by work, evenings spent texting with friends he had never met, the faint perfume that didn't belong to her. It wasn't evidence, not yet, but it was enough to spark an obsession, a need to know what had been hidden from him. Daniel found himself moving through the apartment with a quiet vigilance he had never known. He noticed details he had previously overlooked. Receipts tucked into drawers, a lipstick smear on the edge of her coffee cup, an unopened envelope with a name he didn't recognize. Each discovery was small, but together they formed a mosaic of unease. He could no longer separate paranoia from possibility. Every shadow was suspect, every gesture potentially a lie. In the office, Daniel's focus wavered. Emails blurred on the screen, meetings became background noise as he sifted through subtle clues in his mind. He remembered snippets of Vanessa's conversations, casual remarks that at once seemed inconsequential. Dinner with a colleague, working late at the studio, just a quick trip to LA. At the time, he had nodded, trusting, even amused by her ambition. But now the subtext was unmistakable. Distance, secrecy, a life existing beside him, but apart from him. That evening, Daniel returned home earlier than usual to hope to catch Vanessa in a moment of candor, hoping for a sliver of honesty. She was lounging on the couch, phone in hand, a faint smile dancing across her lips. His pulse quickened. The shadows of suspicion were no longer passive. They demanded confrontation. "Who are you texting?" Daniel asked, voice low, controlled, though his heart pounded in his chest. Vanessa glanced up, startled, then composed herself. "Just work," she said smoothly, sliding the phone under a cushion. Her expression was calm, but there was a flicker, a hesitation that Daniel noted immediately. That small crack in her composure confirmed what he had feared. She was hiding something. Over the next few days, Daniel became a quiet observer of his own home. He moved through the rooms as if on patrol, noting patterns, timing her movements, memorizing routines. The subtle cues he had ignored for years now screamed at him. A laugh that lingered too long at a message, a carefully chosen outfit, a sudden detour on a walk. The intimacy between them, once so familiar, had evaporated, replaced by calculated gestures, performances meant to maintain appearances. One evening, he found an untraceable credit card receipt tucked into the lining of her handbag. It listed an address in a part of the city Vanessa claims she rarely visited. His fingers trembled as he held it, the paper cutting lightly into his skin. The realization hit him with a quiet force. Her secrets were tangible, woven into the fabric of their life together. The woman he had loved, trusted, and shared decades with was moving in a world he did not inhabit, and perhaps never would.
Daniel's mind oscillated between confrontation and observation. Part of him wanted to demand the truth immediately, to tear the illusion apart with words sharp enough to cut through years of deceit. But another part, cautious, strategic, urged patience. Knowledge, he realized, was power. Every gesture, every slip, every small lie could form a map to the truth, and he would follow it carefully, meticulously, without alerting her that the hunt had begun. Late at night, Daniel would sit by the bay window, watching the city lights shimmer on the water and replay Vanessa's words in his mind. "Never forget you're replaceable." The phrase no longer felt like a warning. It was a challenge. He had been reduced to a specter, an optional presence in the life he had built with her. The sting of betrayal was sharpened by the mystery. Not only had she hurt him with her words, but she had also obscured the depth of her disloyalty. He found himself returning to memories he had once cherished, their first apartment in the Mission District, their laughter echoing through narrow streets, the quiet breakfasts in sunlight. Each memory was now tinged with suspicion. Daniel realized he could no longer trust even the past, as if Vanessa's hidden life had rewritten it retroactively. He was left navigating a world in which he had been blind, where familiarity had been replaced by uncertainty. By the end of the week, Daniel's internal map of suspicion was complete. He had documented patterns, recalled conversations, and cataloged behaviors that hinted at infidelity. The shadows were no longer intangible. They had shape, form, and location.
And with that knowledge came a decision. Unspoken, but inevitable. The house, once a sanctuary of shared dreams, had become a stage for deception. The performance was over, and the curtain was about to fall. As he lay awake that night, listening to the soft rhythm of rain against the windows, Daniel felt the weight of inevitability pressing down. The cracks in the glass were no longer minor fractures. They had widened, jagged, and irreparable. Vanessa's duplicity was no longer an abstract fear, but a tangible, looming reality. And for Daniel, the path forward had crystallized. Action, clarity, and a confrontation that could no longer be delayed.
The apartment was silent, save for the faint hum of the city outside. Rain streaked the windows, casting the living room in muted shadows. Daniel Whitman sat in the armchair by the bay window, glass of whiskey untouched in his hand, staring at the reflections of streetlights on the wet streets below. The storm outside mirrored the one raging within him, a quiet, relentless pressure that had been building for months, now reaching its apex. He thought of Vanessa, her words echoing in his mind like a cruel refrain. Never forget you're replaceable. The phrase had once seemed abstract, a fleeting sting in an otherwise ordinary day. But now, after weeks of observation, reflection, and the accumulation of undeniable evidence, it had become a verdict. Each text, each unexplained absence, each subtle deception had led to this moment of reckoning. Daniel rose and walked through the apartment, the hardwood creaking softly underfoot. He glanced at the photographs on the walls, their wedding day, vacations in Napa, and the California coast, moments frozen in time that once brought warmth now delivered only a cold reminder of trust betrayed. He paused at a picture of them laughing at a gala, Vanessa's hand resting lightly on his arm, eyes sparkling with amusement. The facade was perfect, but he knew the truth lurking beneath. He had been living with a version of her carefully curated for public consumption, while the real Vanessa existed somewhere beyond his reach. The decision came not with anger but with clarity. It was not a choice born of impulse, it was inevitability. The life he had built, the home he had shared, and the trust he had placed in his marriage had been compromised. Daniel understood in the deepest parts of himself that he could no longer coexist with someone who viewed him as optional, replaceable. There would be no negotiation, no compromise. This night would mark the end of the illusion. He poured himself a drink, letting the amber liquid catch the dim light, and sat at the dining table, pen and paper before him. Letters had always been a way for him to clarify thoughts he could not voice aloud, and tonight would be no different. He wrote with deliberate precision, outlining the reasons, the evidence, and the conclusion he had reached. The words flowed steadily: betrayal, deception, disrespect, and finally termination. Vanessa would leave tonight. The divorce papers would follow in the morning. The clock ticked toward midnight. Daniel moved through the apartment methodically, checking doors and windows, ensuring the space was secure. He wasn't afraid of confrontation. He had rehearsed the words in his mind countless times, but he wanted control, a measure of dignity in what could otherwise be a chaotic moment. The storm outside intensified, thunder rolling across the bay echoing the turbulence in his heart. When Vanessa returned, the apartment was dark, the only light emanating from the soft glow of the kitchen. She carried herself with her usual grace, but Daniel noticed a subtle tension, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. The moment of confrontation arrived silently. No grand gestures, no dramatic announcements. He waited until she set her purse down and glanced at him, eyes widening slightly as if sensing the shift in the air.
"Vanessa," he said quietly, voice calm but carrying an unmistakable weight. She looked up, searching his face for signs of anger, of hesitation, but found none. "We need to talk." Her brow furrowed slightly, the first genuine display of unease he had seen in weeks. "About what?" she asked, though the question sounded fragile, rehearsed. Daniel's hands rested on the table, steady, deliberate. "About us," he replied simply. "About the truth that's been hiding in plain sight for far too long." He watched her carefully, noting every micro-expression, the subtle shift in her posture, the quick inhale, the tightening of her jaw.
Vanessa opened her mouth, then closed it again, searching for an answer that wouldn't come. Daniel continued, detailing, without accusation, the series of actions and omissions that had shattered his trust. The late nights, the secret trips, the hidden communications. Every observation was precise, almost clinical, yet delivered with the controlled intensity of someone who had carried the weight of suspicion for too long. Vanessa's eyes glistened with the first hint of vulnerability he had seen in months. She tried to speak, to explain, to deflect, but the words fell flat against the certainty in Daniel's eyes. He didn't need confession. He had long ceased to require it. What mattered now was resolution, not dialogue. Finally, Daniel stood. He felt the gravity of the night settling around him, a mixture of sorrow, relief, and finality. I can't live in a marriage where I am optional. I won't. You need to leave. Tonight. Vanessa remained silent, the weight of his decision pressing against her like an unseen hand. She didn't protest, didn't argue. For the first time, the carefully constructed mask of composure faltered. She collected her things in near silence, movements hesitant, eyes downcast. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken history, love, disappointment, and betrayal, a tapestry of emotions condensed into a single decisive moment. When the door closed behind her, the apartment was empty in a way it had never been before. The storm outside had passed, leaving only the faint patter of rain and the distant glow of city lights. Daniel remained standing, staring at the closed door, feeling the finality settle deep into his bones. The life they had shared was over. The illusion of perfection had been shattered, and in its place stood clarity, a stark understanding of his own value and limits. In the quiet aftermath, Daniel sat down, finally lifting the untouched glass of whiskey. He inhaled deeply, tasting both loss and liberation. The decision had been made, not in anger, but in unwavering recognition of truth. That night marked the end of something profound, and the beginning of something equally important, reclaiming himself, his dignity, and the life he would now navigate alone. As he gazed out at the city, lights reflecting off puddles in the street below, he felt a mixture of grief and resolve. There would be consequences, pain, perhaps even regret, but the choice was his, and for the first time in months, he felt in control again. In the dark, clarity shone brighter than any illusion ever could.
The apartment was quiet, almost unnaturally so, after Vanessa's departure. Daniel sat in the dimly lit living room, the faint hum of the city below a distant echo. The storm had passed, leaving only the faint smell of rain and the lingering tension in the air. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of the apartment not as a shared home, but as his own, a space reclaimed from the shadows of betrayal. He thought back over the night, the way Vanessa had left without a word, the subtle hesitations in her movements, the fleeting glances she had given him. Their marriage, once a carefully orchestrated dance of appearances and compromise, had ended with the simplicity and finality of a slammed door. The house that had been a stage for illusions now felt like a sanctuary. Though it was empty, it belonged fully to him. The following days were surreal. Daniel moved through the apartment methodically, cleaning, rearranging, reclaiming spaces that felt alien in Vanessa's presence. He found small traces of her lingered, a scarf draped over a chair, a half-empty glass on the counter. Each item stirred a mixture of resentment and sorrow, yet with each act of removal or organization, he felt a flicker of liberation. The physical act of clearing her presence became symbolic, a reclamation of control, identity, and autonomy. He spent long hours revisiting the memories of their life together, vacations to Napa, quiet breakfasts, late-night conversations. Each recollection now carried dual meaning. Love existed, undeniably, but so did deception. Daniel realized that grief and clarity could coexist, that loss did not negate wisdom gained. He allowed himself to feel, to mourn what had been genuine, while acknowledging the fractures that had made their relationship unsustainable. At work, Daniel's focus sharpened. The routines that had once felt monotonous now carried purpose. He channeled his energy into decisions, projects, and meetings, finding a sense of control that had been absent during the growing shadow of Vanessa's duplicity. Yet, beneath professional composure, his mind replayed moments of doubt, the subtle signs he had ignored, and the echo of her words, "Never forget you're replaceable." The phrase no longer stung with humiliation. It resonated as a hard-earned lesson in self-respect and boundaries. The social aftermath was more complicated. Friends reached out, some cautiously, others with curiosity and veiled concern. Daniel navigated these interactions with measured honesty, revealing as much as necessary while protecting his privacy. He realized that life beyond Vanessa's performance involved redefining relationships, establishing new norms, and understanding that perception did not dictate reality. The illusion that had consumed him for years was now entirely shattered. Late at night, Daniel often walked along the Embarcadero, the cool breeze carrying the faint scent of salt from the bay. He observed couples laughing, strangers hurrying home, and the city lights reflected on the water like fractured jewels. In these moments, clarity settled around him. He had been blindsided, not only by a betrayal, but also by his own willingness to ignore subtle truths, to accept appearances over substance. The aftermath of confrontation, of decision, was not just Vanessa's absence, it was his awakening.
Among the remnants of their shared life, Daniel discovered unexpected freedom. Tasks that had once felt shared, now wholly his responsibility, became acts of empowerment rather than burden. Financial decisions, social calendars, even the seemingly trivial details of home maintenance were now exercises in agency. He embraced the solitude not as loneliness, but as a space for introspection, strategy, and growth. Yet the emotional aftermath was more complex. Daniel experienced waves of doubt, pangs of sadness, and moments of intense longing. Human attachment, even when betrayed, does not dissolve instantly. He allowed himself to sit with discomfort, understanding that recovery was neither linear nor simple. Journals became his confidants, penning reflections that captured grief, anger, clarity, and hope. He wrote about loss without bitterness, about deception without self-recrimination, and about the emerging understanding of his own worth. The digital shadows Vanessa left behind also demanded attention. Emails, messages, social media, each click, each review was a step toward closure. Daniel sifted through them not for evidence of guilt anymore, but to disentangle himself emotionally. The process was painstaking, but necessary. By confronting these digital traces, he regained sovereignty over his mental space, ensuring that the ghosts of her duplicity would not linger indefinitely. By the end of the week, a transformation had taken root. Daniel felt a quiet, hard-earned resolve. The apartment no longer felt like a stage for pretense, but a home for reflection and planning. The betrayal, though deep, had illuminated truths about human vulnerability, attachment, and personal boundaries. He had faced deception, reclaimed autonomy, and in doing so, had discovered the resilience that had always existed beneath layers of trust and compromise. That night, Daniel sat by the bay window once more, a notebook open on his lap. The city slept quietly, streetlights glimmering on wet pavements, the occasional car passing like a heartbeat in the night. He reflected on the journey from illusion to awareness, from subtle suspicion to decisive action. The aftermath was not a single event, but an ongoing process, one that demanded introspection, courage, and unwavering attention to truth. In the quiet, Daniel understood something profound. Life after betrayal was not about punishment, not about revenge. It was about reclamation, reclaiming time, space, trust in oneself, and the freedom to live authentically. He had removed the woman who had deemed him replaceable, but in doing so, he had also removed the constraints on his own self-worth. The aftermath was a crucible, forging clarity and strength from the shards of a broken illusion. And as the city lights shimmered across the bay, Daniel finally allowed himself to feel a faint sense of peace, knowing that he had survived, and more importantly, that he had learned to value himself above the shadows of deception. The storm had passed, leaving not just emptiness, but also the beginning of a new, unencumbered chapter.
The weeks that followed Vanessa's departure were a strange, almost disorienting mix of liberation and introspection. Daniel moved through his days with a quiet intensity, a measured pace that belied the turmoil he had endured. The apartment, once a gallery of shared illusions, now became a canvas for his own reclamation. Each corner he organized, each item he placed with intention, served as a subtle ritual of control, a reaffirmation that the life he would now lead was wholly his own. Yet the mind has a persistence that physical spaces cannot quell. Daniel's thoughts often drifted back to Vanessa, to the woman he had loved and the persona she had presented to the world. He remembered the initial cracks, the subtle absences, the glances toward her phone, the inexplicable detours and late-night messages. What he once dismissed as trivial quirks now appeared as glaring omissions, pieces of a carefully orchestrated puzzle that he had only now begun to assemble. He found himself revisiting the timeline of their relationship with forensic precision. Every anniversary, every dinner, every casual conversation was examined anew, like a detective scrutinizing a crime scene. The realization that he had been living alongside deception for so long was both staggering and strangely clarifying. He had been complicit in the illusion, blinded by love, trust, and the comforting rhythm of familiarity. The reckoning was not only with Vanessa, but with himself, for the willingness to overlook the subtle truths that had demanded acknowledgement. At work, Daniel's demeanor had shifted subtly. He moved with a greater focus, decisions carried a newfound weight, and conversations, even mundane ones, were approached with heightened awareness. Colleagues noted a quiet confidence, a presence that suggested someone who had confronted profound personal upheaval and emerged with clarity. Yet beneath the calm, there was a simmering intensity, a mind still processing betrayal, deception, and the consequences of trust misplaced. One evening, Daniel took a long walk along the waterfront, the city lights casting fractured reflections on the bay. The cool breeze carried the faint scent of salt and rain, each inhalation grounding him in the present while the mind replayed past grievances. He considered Vanessa, not with a desire to rekindle or confront, but as an essential part of his reckoning. The betrayal, the words she had spoken, and the life they had shared all existed now as lessons etched deeply into his consciousness. He reflected on the phrase that had haunted him since that night, "Never forget you're replaceable." Initially a weapon, it had evolved into a mirror. Daniel realized that value is not assigned by others, nor is permanence guaranteed by love alone. Trust must be nurtured, boundaries enforced, and self-worth recognized independently of external validation. The pain of betrayal had forged an understanding that clarity and respect are inseparable, and that ignoring the small fractures in a relationship can lead to irreparable damage. Daniel also wrestled with guilt, an unexpected companion in the aftermath. Guilt for what he had overlooked, for the emotional distance he may have contributed to, for the moments when he had prioritized routine over engagement. The introspection was painful, yet necessary. Forgiveness, he realized, would not be about absolving Vanessa, but about reconciling with the parts of himself that had allowed deception to flourish unnoticed. In the quiet of the apartment, Daniel began writing again. Not letters, not plans, but reflections. Pages filled with thoughts on love, trust, betrayal, and resilience. He documented feelings that had previously gone unspoken, mapped patterns of behavior he now understood, and articulated the boundaries he would never again compromise. The act of writing became a ritual of catharsis, a bridge from grief to understanding, a tangible manifestation of reckoning. Friends began to reach out more frequently, sensing the change in him. Conversations that once skimmed the surface now ventured into depth. Daniel discovered a renewed capacity for empathy, tempered by wisdom and strengthened by the clarity he had gained. He listened more intently, engaged more sincerely, and maintained vigilance over his own emotions, ensuring that lessons learned were integrated, not merely observed. Financially and practically, the aftermath demanded adjustments.
Vanessa's absence meant the recalibration of household routines, finances, and shared responsibilities. Yet Daniel approached each challenge with equanimity. The practicalities of post-betrayal life became exercises in agency, reinforcing the broader understanding that independence and self-determination are crucial foundations for resilience. Each decision, from mundane domestic matters to strategic financial choices, was infused with a sense of purpose, born of hard-earned clarity. Most profoundly, Daniel confronted the emotional consequences. Grief, anger, and longing surfaced in waves, sometimes overwhelming, sometimes fleeting, but never without recognition. He allowed himself to feel, understanding that emotional honesty was a necessary companion to the analytical rigor he had applied. The reckoning was as much internal as external. It was a confrontation with loss, with human vulnerability, and with the self he had been and the self he was becoming. By the end of the month, a pattern emerged. Daniel's life, once overshadowed by suspicion and betrayal, was slowly returning to equilibrium. The apartment felt lived in again, his routines restored, and his perspective sharpened. He had moved from reactive despair to proactive clarity, embracing the lessons etched in the aftermath of Vanessa's departure. Reflection had brought understanding, and understanding had laid the groundwork for a future defined not by what had been lost, but by what he would now safeguard: his dignity, his autonomy, and the truth of his own worth. The city outside continued its rhythm, indifferent to personal drama, yet intimately entwined with his experience. Lights glimmered on the water, cars passed in steady flow, and distant laughter drifted through the night air. Daniel, seated at the bay window with his journal open, allowed himself a quiet smile. The reckoning was not a conclusion, but a transformation, a passage from illusion to awareness, from betrayal to comprehension, from loss to a hard-won sense of self. He closed the journal, letting the finality settle. The shadows of suspicion had been confronted. The storm of betrayal endured, and the echoes of Vanessa's words now served as markers of resilience rather than instruments of pain. Reflection had revealed the depth of the fracture, and reckoning had offered the tools for reconstruction. The past, though indelible, no longer dictated the terms of his existence. And as Daniel watched the city breathe under the night sky, he understood that the path forward, though uncertain, was entirely his to navigate. He had faced betrayal, confronted deception, and emerged with clarity. The reflection in the window was no longer a man haunted by the illusion of perfection, but someone tempered by truth, fortified by experience, and ready to reclaim life on his own terms.
The morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Daniel's apartment, scattering gold across the hardwood floors. The city below stirred awake, indifferent to his journey, yet intimately woven into the fabric of his transformation. For the first time in months, the apartment felt entirely his own, not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually. The shadows of betrayal that had once clung to the walls had receded, leaving space for clarity, presence, and possibility. Daniel sat at the bay window, a cup of coffee steaming in his hands, and let the quiet settle around him. The past, once raw and sharp with pain, now existed as a series of lessons carefully etched into his consciousness. He reflected on the months since Vanessa's departure, the stormy nights of suspicion, the painful confrontations, the deliberate reclamation of his space, and the rigorous, often uncomfortable self-reflection. Every moment, every decision had led him here, on the precipice of a new life. He thought of Vanessa, and for the first time, he felt a sense of closure rather than resentment. The betrayal, though deep, had illuminated truths about trust, autonomy, and the limits of endurance. Acceptance did not mean erasing pain, nor did it entail forgiveness in the conventional sense. It meant recognizing reality without distortion, acknowledging the hurt without being consumed by it, and stepping forward with intention rather than reaction. Daniel allowed himself to release the emotional weight that had clung so tightly for so long. The city skyline reflected on the bay like fractured glass, each shard catching the light differently, some sharp, some softened. Daniel saw a metaphor in the reflection. Life, even when broken, can refract beauty and clarity if approached with awareness and care. The life he had shared with Vanessa was now part of that reflection, a mixture of bright and dark, truth and illusion, love and betrayal. It was over, yet it had been meaningful, teaching him about resilience, discernment, and self-worth. Daniel rose and moved through the apartment with purpose, opening blinds, rearranging furniture, and letting in light in both literal and symbolic terms. Each act was a reclamation, a small assertion of control and presence. He smiled faintly at the thought that the space, once filled with tension and uncertainty, could now accommodate peace, creativity, and growth. It was his canvas, and for the first time, he felt free to paint without fear of deception or judgment. He reached for his journal, pages filled with reflections, strategies, and observations. Writing had been a bridge from grief to understanding, and now it became a tool for vision and planning. Daniel sketched out goals, professional ambitions, personal growth, and emotional milestones. He considered travel, new connections, and projects that had been postponed or ignored during the turbulence of his marriage. Each plan carried a quiet excitement, a recognition that life continued, and that he could shape it with deliberate choice rather than circumstance.
Socially, Daniel began to reconnect with friends, not as a man seeking validation, but as someone confident in his autonomy. Conversations were more intentional, laughter more present, and relationships more grounded in authenticity rather than obligation. He understood that rebuilding trust externally began with the internal work he had already done: acceptance of the past, discernment in the present, and clarity of intention for the future. Evenings brought moments of reflection by the bay window, watching the city lights shimmer and pulse in rhythm with his own heartbeat. He allowed himself to feel gratitude for the lessons learned, for the resilience discovered in solitude, and for the clarity gained from facing betrayal head-on. The pain, while still present, had softened, tempered by understanding and acceptance. It was a quiet ache rather than a sharp wound, a companion to wisdom rather than a source of torment. Daniel also embraced new routines, rediscovering pleasures long set aside, reading novels he had neglected, jogging along the waterfront, experimenting with cooking, and even attending small gallery openings and concerts. Each act was a reminder that life, though marked by loss, offered abundant opportunities for connection, creativity, and joy. He realized that his capacity for love and engagement had not diminished. It had evolved, shaped by experience and tempered by clarity. One evening, as he walked along the waterfront with a notebook tucked under his arm, Daniel paused to watch the horizon. The sun had set, leaving a palette of oranges, purples, and deep blues reflecting on the water. He felt a profound sense of presence, a deep knowing that he had endured a storm and emerged not diminished but strengthened. Acceptance was no longer an abstract concept. It was alive in his posture, his gaze, and the calm rhythm of his thoughts. He allowed himself a small, quiet smile. Life after betrayal was not defined by loss, but by the courage to confront truth, embrace reality, and move forward deliberately. The horizon was expansive, not confined by past mistakes or the shadow of deception. Daniel felt ready, for the first time in a long while, to step into new experiences, new relationships, and new chapters with confidence and clarity. As night settled over the city, Daniel returned to his apartment, windows open to the cool air, the sounds of life outside, a steady reminder of continuity. He poured a glass of wine, toasted quietly to the journey endured, and sat at the window, looking out over the bay. Acceptance was not passive, it was active, a commitment to live fully, to honor his own worth, and to embrace possibility. And in that stillness, Daniel understood that the past, though irrevocable, was a foundation, not a prison. The betrayal had revealed truths, the aftermath had cultivated resilience, and the reflections had forged clarity. Now, standing on the edge of new horizons, he felt a quiet certainty. Life was his to shape, unbound by illusions and rich with potential for joy, authenticity, and meaningful connection. With a deep, deliberate breath, Daniel allowed himself to step fully into the moment, letting the city, the night, and his own hard-won wisdom guide him forward. The journey had been painful, yes, but it had also been transformative. And as he watched the horizon stretch endlessly before him, Daniel finally understood what it meant to live fully, free from the shadows of the past, and open to all the possibilities that lay ahead.